photograph of that wall of earth. Like I said, there's a lack of conservation. Both family farmers and corporate farmers just plowed without any thought of what damage they were doing. And eventually it's going to catch up to them when the weather temporarily changes. And so states and the federal government will initiate a couple things. One, soil conservation, and two, water policies, water restrictions, irrigation. So those are going to be some of the things that come out of the Dust Bowl. John Steinbeck's novel, Grapes of Wrath, comes from these hundreds of thousands of people who fled to California. So, it is relatively easy to find jobs for out-of-work carpenters and plumbers and electricians. It's relatively easy to find jobs for people who know how to dig ditches or chop down trees. It's a little bit more difficult to find jobs for people who have degrees, like a bachelor's degree in history or English or humanities. So that's where we go with culture. FDR supports and Congress passes a number of opportunities to help people with degrees. Here's what we do. One, we hire people to build theaters, public theaters. So we got some plumbers and electricians and carpenters to build these physical theaters. Then we bring in out-of-work painters to paint the buildings, to paint these murals inside and outside the buildings. And then we hire out-of-work playwrights and English majors to write plays that will be performed, and then we hire out-of-work actors. And so we have a lot of people being put to work, and then the result is these free public productions. Well, the other thing that we're going to do is Congress is going to pass something called the Federal Writers Project. The Federal Writers Project did a bunch of stuff. The one thing I'm going to talk about is the slave narratives. Slaves, or I should say ex-slaves, were still very much alive in the 1930s, and well, maybe not very much alive. For most part, they were in their early 90s. At least the ones who can remember being slaves are going to be in their, between 88 and about 95. Now, the older we get, we tend to fill in the blanks. The brain likes order. The brain likes going from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. And so if we forget 2, the brain is going to create 2. The brain is going to fill in the rest of the story. We're not purposefully lying. That's just what the brain likes. The brain likes order. So we know bits and pieces, and then we start filling in the rest. Like I said, we're not purposefully lying. That's just what happens when we get old and start forgetting stuff, and the brain kicks in and fills in the blanks. So that's one aspect to consider. 2, the older we get, we typically romanticize the past. High school was horrible for you. You were picked on. You weren't in the in crowd. And then where are you 10 years later? Going back to your 10-year high school reunion. Oh, I missed you guys. So, we tend to romanticize the past. So that's the second thing. Now, here's what the federal government does. The Federal Writers Project will hire out-of-work history majors and English majors and anthropology majors and sociology majors. They will be given lists of the addresses of these ex-slaves, and they'll be told, find these ex-slaves and interview them. Type up the interview and take the transcript to the Smithsonian, the National Archives. And we'll have this plethora of these oral histories from ex-slaves. So that's what these folks do. They wander around the South primarily. They find these ex-slaves and they interview them. Now, there are two very types of interviews, or two very different types of transcripts if you look at the slave narratives in the National Archives. The vast majority talk about slavery as if it was not that big of a deal. They don't talk about the violence, the sexual abuse, the separation of families, the torture. They tend to downplay that stuff. That slavery was a period in U.S. history. It was not a good thing. It was immoral or unethical. But these ex-slaves were like, well, we survived, and we don't worry about the past. We talk about the future. The other type of transcript you would read, and this is the minority of transcripts, are these ex-slaves talks about the brutality of slavery, the evils of slavery, the sexual abuse, the ripping apart of families, the torture. So how do we get to these two very different narratives? Well, some historians looked at the characteristics of the people who performed the oral histories, these out-of-work historians and English majors and anthropology majors and sociology majors. And they found out this: when a white person knocked on the door of an ex-slave and said, "Hi, I'm here from the government, I want to talk to you about slavery," they typically whitewashed slavery. It wasn't that bad. When an African-American knocked on your door and say, "Hi, I'm from the government, I want to talk about slavery," that's when they opened up. So the lesson that we learned is that it really matters who performs these oral histories. What you need to do is you need the population that you're going to interview to have some connection through the interviewee. Otherwise, you could have problems like the Federal Writers Project does. I mean, these documents, the National Archives, are absolutely national treasures. And I don't remember the name of the person who came up with this, but whoever sat down and said, "You know what, we should be interviewing these ex-slaves because they're in their 90s and they'll be dead soon." Possibly one of the best things that came out of the New Deal is this treasure trove of personal stories. And finally, we see the transformation in American pop culture. In the 20s and early, well, first of all, cops and robbers movies were all the rage in the 20s and 30s. And one of the most popular actors was a guy named James Cagney. Now, James Cagney almost always played the robber. Cagney was a little guy, I mean, in real life, kind of a short guy. But he always played bigger than life on the silver screen. And as the robber, he was always the hero. In fact, in these cops and robbers movies in the 20s until the early 30s, the robbers were the heroes. The cops were bumbling, stumbling buffoons, and just, the village idiot, the hillbillies. And the robbers were physically attractive. They dressed much better, much more snazzy. They had nice cars. They were much more intelligent, much more charismatic. And then we have the professionalization of the police in large measure because of that St. Valentine's Day massacre I talked about happening in the 20s. And so the professionalization of the police, along with the reality that Americans find out about how banks and big businesses really hurt workers and the economy, an unregulated economy, was horribly dangerous to both workers and the economy. Americans lost interest in the robbers and was interested in cops. A really good example of that is a movie called Angels with Dirty Faces. Angels with Dirty Faces was about a robber played by James Cagney. His name was Rocky. And Rocky spent most of his life in and out of prison. Rocky grew up with a friend of his who turned out to be a Catholic priest. When Rocky was not in prison, he would come back to the neighborhood, and he had his nice new clothes on, and he had his flashy car, and all the kids, poor kids in the neighborhood, would come running up to James Cagney, the robber, and he would hand out coins, and so the kids looked up to the robber, James Cagney. The kids wanted to be like James Cagney when they grew up, or the James Cagney character. So the friend, the Roman Catholic priest, had to work really hard to keep these kids on the path of straight and narrow. Well, at the end of the movie, James Cagney, his character will be sentenced to death, and his friend, the old Catholic priest, says, do me a favor, as you're being dragged to the electric chair, break down. Scream and cry, beg for mercy. What I'd like you to do is show these kids that you're not this tough guy, that robbers, that people who break the laws are inherently weak, and thus they should not be elevated to hero worship in this neighborhood. And that's what he does. As he's being dragged to the electric chair, he starts crying and screaming and begging for mercy. That's Angels with Dirty Faces. There were some limits, like court packing. Republicans sure didn't like it. Many Democrats sure didn't like it. And a lot of Americans really thought that FDR was going too far. Well, these New Deal legislations, especially for relief, did not include women. In fact, Roosevelt asked women in the federal government to quit, to make spaces to hire men, which, of course, today is completely unconstitutional, but perfectly legal at that time. And so his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, right down here, created what she called the Women's Network. The Women's Network were people, women, who she worked with. For example, whenever she had a press conference, which was every day, all the reporters had to be women, the people who ran the cameras were women, the writers were women, the editors were women, the producers were women, her advisors were women. For example, Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune, right here, was the director of Negro Affairs for the National Youth Administration. Now, Mary McLeod Bethune had been the vice president of the NAACP before she was brought into the FDR administration. So, as director of Negro Affairs, Mary McLeod Bethune was the highest-ranking African-American in FDR's administration. I mentioned Frances Perkins, the first woman to hold a cabinet position in U.S. history. She was Secretary of Labor. Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman way, way, way ahead of her time. She did so much for civil rights, so much for women's rights, so much for equality in this country in general, that a lot of historians argued Eleanor Roosevelt should have been the first woman on a U.S. denomination, not Harriet Tubman. I mean, Harriet Tubman did important work, but it was for a limited time, for a limited amount of people. Eleanor Roosevelt's work still resounds with us today. And there was others who said people like Carrie Chapman Catt or Alice Paul, who helped bring about the 19th Amendment, giving half of the country full citizenship and thus the right to vote. So, anyhow, a lot of historians thought that Eleanor Roosevelt should have been on, her picture should have been on the $20 bill. Eleanor Roosevelt was a woman ahead of her time in several examples. One, she traveled around the country giving speeches on equality, not just gender equality, but on racial equality. And a lot of the places she visited were segregated. And when she spoke, there was the one side of the room for the white women and the other side of the room for black women. So when Eleanor Roosevelt had those experiences, she would move her podium to the middle of the room, right between the black women and the white women. Eleanor Roosevelt, I said the Roosevelts have a long history in this country. Some would say the Mayflower, some would say not quite that old, but still, they've been here for a long, long time. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. The Daughters of the American Revolution held and still do a big conference, a big meeting every year, and the entertainment that year was probably the most well-known operatic singer at that time, this African-American woman named Marian Anderson. Well, the DAR was an organization established by white women for white women, very conservative, like I said, nativists when I talked about the establishment of their organization in the 1890s. And this is one thing that had always concerned Eleanor Roosevelt, being a member of an organization that is outwardly hostile towards minorities. Well, the thing that got Eleanor Roosevelt really ticked off was when Marian Anderson was brought in to the DAR conference, and she was, part of the entertainment. But because she was black and the DAR was segregated, they would not allow Marian Anderson to mingle with Eleanor Roosevelt and the other members of the DAR. In fact, she wasn't even allowed to sit down and eat lunch with them. She had to go back in the kitchen and eat lunch. She wasn't allowed to use the front entrance. Because she was black, she had to use the kitchen entrance, the service entrance. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was so upset with that on Easter Sunday, 1943, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, Eleanor Roosevelt held a press conference in which she officially resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she introduced her friend, Marian Anderson, who sang a few songs. I believe one was God Bless America. The last thing was what we call the Roosevelt recession. The economy actually dipped in 1937, and it dipped in 1937 for a couple of reasons. One, Congress took their foot off the gas pedal of funding. The economy was not stable enough to go on its own, and that's what Congress looked at by spending less. That's like if you have stress fracture. You know when people have stress fractures because they're walking around with those really big, attractive walking boots. Now, a stress fracture takes about 4 to 6 weeks to heal, depending on your age and how healthy you are. And so I've had several of them in my life because I'm a long-distance runner, and that happens. And then the older you get, which that happens too, these bones in your feet just start fracturing. So I've done that several times, and I'm in the boot, and because I'm a runner, because I'm in pretty good shape, and because I'm a guy who likes to set goals and then not just meet the goals, but do better than the goals. So if I'm in that boot for 4 to 6 weeks, I'll test it out at 2 weeks. I'll take the boot off and I'll try walking. A little painful, so I'll put it on another week and I'll try it in week 3. And it's not too bad. And I can walk maybe a mile. So I take it real easy, and by week 4 that boot is gone. And I start walking, and by week 5 I'm walking 5 miles a day. And by week 6, now I start running 5 miles a day. So that's what I did. I tested it to see how it is, and I went a little easy, and then boom. Well, that's what Congress does in 37. They test the economy by not spending as much, and the economy is not fully healed, and so we go into a recession. Also, FDR was really interested in trying to balance the budget. He was, if nothing else, a believer in capitalism, and one aspect in capitalism is that it works really, really well when there's not huge deficits. So, or I should say, it works better when there's no huge deficits. So, Roosevelt wanted to pay off the national debt. So, that's another reason why Congress spent less money. Very quickly, in 37, we find out that the economy is not ready for that. So, in 38, spending goes back up. Well, here's the election of 1940. Roosevelt gets reelected. Wendell Willkie, the Republican, loses, but notice that he wins a little bit more, especially in the Central Plains. The 36 election, remember, Alf Landon only wins Vermont and Maine. Well, Wendell Willkie wins Vermont and Maine, Michigan, Indiana, and all these northern Central Plains states. So, is there a waning of popularity for FDR? Well, this is FDR's 3rd term. And a lot of people, Republicans primarily, but certainly some Democrats, believe that Roosevelt should just go away after a 2nd term. And the reason why is because that's what Washington did. George Washington was re-elected, and after serving 2 terms, he retired. Nothing in the Constitution that said Washington had to retire. That's what he did. He established that precedent. And so there were many men who were really popular in the 19th century who could have probably won a third term, but they did not run because Washington did not. So people are saying, FDR, you think you're better than Washington? And he's like, well, let's see. So he wins his third term. And he's going to win a fourth term. And then we'll eventually change the Constitution, which says you can only do two terms in a row.